Hi guys, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am giving you a delightfully niche topic in line with my particular interests and pet peeves, and that is how to realistically portray college admissions in YA fiction. College admissions in just college. You're like, wow, Alexa, that's interestingly specific. So for those of you who don't know, in addition to writing novels and working in marketing, I have I love college admissions. Specifically, I love helping teenagers with their admissions essays in particular, but also just general admissions information. This is partly because education is a topic really close to my heart. A college scholarship changed my life. Attending this really fancy private university that challenged me academically, truly challenged me for the first time in my life, coming from public schools in some of the less nice states and districts of the nation. I grew up in some of the worst public school systems in the country. College changed my life, and it was a scholarship that changed my life. And I love helping low-income students and students from less privileged backgrounds kind of figure it all out. But the thing is, college admissions have changed a lot since I applied to and attended college. And it's been about 15 years since I was applying to college, and it's been about 11 years since I graduated from college. I know to some of you, if you're younger viewers, you're like, well, that's a long time. It's really not a long time when you are a little bit older. It's like that. And in terms of just like cost alone, to give you some context, when I graduated in 2006, my private university cost $42,000 a year, which I thought was ridiculous. And now that same school costs $65,000 a year, and I expect it to hit $70,000 in the next year or so, because colleges are constantly ticking up. A famous one I'll give you, NYU is $72,000 a year as of last year. That is bonkers. And that is change that has happened in basically just 10 years. And here's the thing. Most YA writers are my age. Some of you are babes who are 23, but are my age or older. And anyone who is above the age of 30 for sure just has no idea how much college admissions and college have changed, but specifically college admissions. It is way more competitive than it was when I was applying. I applied to 4 schools. I was 100% confident I would definitely get into at least one of them. My safety from 2001 is no longer a safety for anyone. It's one of the more competitive private schools to get into in the country. Things have just changed a lot. And so, I find that very often in YA novels, the few and rare times I do read YA contemporary, which is not a normal genre for me, but when I do read them, people get it wrong. They get it real wrong. And so I just want to talk about a couple of my pet peeves and the things, why those things aren't accurate, and give you some tips and tools that might help you if you're out there and you are writing about college admissions in YA to help you. This might even help you if you are a younger writer, because not all experiences are created equal. And I'll tell you that privilege greatly impacts the college admissions process. So it's worth giving a listen no matter what age you are to help you write better and more realistic and accurate depictions of college admissions in YA. So just to go over my biggest pet peeves first. So one of them that I see all the time is people messing up the admissions timeline. Most often this happens with early decision, early action, and then of course regular decision, so all the things. But meaning there are authors who don't understand how early action or early decision works. And so we have a character in a book and they find out in November what school they're going to, but it's not even a school that has early action, but they, I see people mess up the timelines a lot, or a student randomly gets into Harvard in February. That doesn't happen. So authors need to be careful when they're looking at their timelines for books set during senior year. So if you're doing something that's only set from September to November, like Homecoming, your characters are not going to be getting into college usually. It depends on the college, but you need to do your research of when are the actual deadlines. Most high school seniors, when they start school, don't know where they're going to college. There's just no way for that to happen, and yet I see a lot of stories where it's September and Susie knows exactly where she's going to college, and it is a college whose deadline isn't happening for 2 months. So I always, that's pet peeve number one for me. Another one that really bugs me is when really poor characters, so characters in the stories who part of their conflict is that they can't afford college and they really need a scholarship and financial aid to be able to attend. And then they go applying early decision to schools that do not give generous financial aid, and they get in with a magical full ride that does not exist in reality. It drives me absolutely crazy because I hate that readers are going to read that and think that that is reality. I frequent forums like College Confidential and the Applying to College subreddit, and so frequently see students with heartbreaking stories of, oh, it was my dream to go here and I can't afford to pay for school, and so I applied to these schools and nothing else, and then they're left with nowhere to go to college, or the only option is crippling 6-figure debt. So I think that unrealistic expectations in YA novels set this up, not just with this pet peeve, but with many more that I have. So similarly, I see so many authors, and I actually see this in all media, only talking about the same 5 to 10 super elite schools, the buzzy big ones that y'all know, like Harvard, Yale, Brown, Columbia, NYU. Occasionally they'll throw a wrench in the works, like Williams or Wellesley or UCLA or UC Berkeley or Stanford. This tight list of super elite schools. So these are the kind of schools that are reach schools for everyone, meaning even if you are the most brilliant person in your class or in your state or in the world, it's still almost in some ways a crapshoot whether or not you're going to get into these reach schools, just because they are the cream of the crop in terms of the academic standards they have for admission, but also the the quality of student, and that gets into a whole area we won't get into about intellectual depth and demonstrating personality and depth in your essays. But these schools are really hard to get into, and I see brilliant students with sparkling personalities who write killer essays get rejected from these schools all the time. There's also privilege that plays into them, i.e. money, because a lot of these schools are not need blind, which that's a whole other subject we'll get into at another time. All of the financial aid terms that you need to know, but meaning I see YA authors setting really unrealistic expectations, because I'll be reading a book with a character, and as they present them, they're like, and their dream school was Harvard, and they applied, and they got in, and I go, that student would not have gotten into Harvard. No, absolutely no way. And they definitely wouldn't have gotten in with a full scholarship. So it's just, what I wish and hope is that YA authors would branch out and definitely do a little bit of research, but understand that sometimes the most realistic option for a character in a book isn't Harvard, it is their state university. That might be their most affordable option, because they just won't be able to afford going to NYU even if they get in. I know this is a bit niche, but a quick Google search or finding an expert, or I shouldn't call myself an expert, a semi-expert such as me to help. I am more than happy to help authors with these kinds of questions. So I just wish authors would kind of do that due diligence, because I do think it's harmful when students read these books and then assume, oh, it's easy to get into Harvard. It's really, really not. I see students every day on these forums, again, who are like, I'm just gonna try, it's worth a shot, and I look at their qualifications and I'm like, you just wasted an application fee. You have you have a hope chance in hell of getting into these schools. Why are you wasting your time? And I think it's because of media, including books, that perpetuate this idea that, if you want it bad enough, that you might get in, and that's just not how it works. And I've hinted at it in some of these other pet peeves, but I really, really hate it in YA novels where the student magically gets a full scholarship to schools that almost never offer full scholarships. So there are different kinds of financial aid. Financial aid is actually really, really, really confusing, and I'll tell you, parents get this wrong all the time. If you are a younger viewer and you're either applying to college or you did recently, you probably wanted to bang your head against a wall because your parents did not understand how money works in college nowadays. Well, neither do 99.9% of YA writers. So full scholarships, so tuition scholarships, are pretty rare as it is, but even more rare are full ride scholarships. So these are situations where a school also pays for your room and board. And let me tell you, top 30 elite schools almost never offer these to anyone, even if you are poor. That's the misnomer. There's this idea that if you are really financially needy and you get into your dream school, they're gonna pay for everything. And there honestly are a lot of schools that are dream crushers because you can get in, but they do what is called gapping. Gapping is when you get a lot of grants and you get a lot of scholarships, except it doesn't cover everything, and it typically doesn't cover room and board, and you are left having to cover $15,000 a year. And the thing is, if you are low income, it can literally be impossible to get $15,000 a year. Your parents might not have the credit to qualify for loans. You might not be able to carry that debt because that is going to be over $60,000 of debt that you can't reasonably handle. And honestly, these are situations where amazing private elite schools, truly low-income students, even if they can get in, simply cannot attend. It is not a fair system. And even if you are middle class, it can be impossible to meet the gap, because when you are middle class, it's far more likely if you do get merit aid from a school, your gap is going to be closer to $30,000 a year, and that is just untenable for the majority of families. Y'all know how I ruin all your dreams about publishing? I think I'm now ruining all your dreams about college too, so sorry about that. It is a brutal and unfair system, and honestly, I expect the college bubble to burst any day now, any year now, because this is truly untenable for the majority of Americans, but it's super unrealistic in most YA fiction. So the other one that drives me crazy is the poor student who is not poor. The poor student who is clearly written by a lovely upper middle class individual who doesn't understand what it actually means to live on or under the poverty line. And then we see this poor student get that magical, non-existent, full ride scholarship. And again, I just think that's unrealistic, because especially when that character clearly isn't actually poor, they're more like lower middle class, which is my class background. It sets up, again, an unrealistic expectation. A talented lower middle class student can do very, very well when it comes to grants and scholarships at certain schools, which is a whole other thing about which schools give money, versus which ones don't. But it is very, very rare to impossible for a lower middle class student to get a full ride from an elite school. So it's so complicated. So you're noticing a trend in this, which is most of my pet peeves revolve around financial aid and class privilege. And that is because I think this is the #1 thing that YA writers mess up, because the majority of YA writers are upper middle class. And this of course ties into a whole conversation about privilege in YA. I do plan on making some in-depth videos on this that carry off of my Publishing is Not a Meritocracy video, because a huge part of that is intersections like class, race, gender, and so on. But with college admissions, we need to talk about class in particular, because I find that most often college admissions are unrealistic, and financial aid is honestly irresponsibly portrayed in YA, because most individuals writing it didn't struggle to pay for college. There was never a question of whether they would go to college, whether they could afford college. They typically don't carry crippling, life-altering debt. They had parents who had college funds for them. And a lot of YA readers, this is not their reality. And even if they are from a higher class background, because of the cost of colleges now, as I mentioned, it is untenable. Even if your parents do have money, you can have to go into crippling debt to go to these fancy ass schools. So I just wish that there was a little bit more reality, that if you do have a student who is going to apply to and get into Harvard, that do your research and make sure that that is actually at least 50% realistic situation. I would love to just see more characters in YA fiction aspire to go to a great state university. Honestly, state universities are the saving grace for a lot of students, because it becomes their only affordable and sure thing academic option. A lot of state universities, they have higher admissions ratios, and there are pros and cons to, of course, going to large state universities, but honestly, I have seen them save the lives of students. But also private universities that just don't have that A-list name brand value. There are some fantastic private universities who are very, very generous with financial aid, and also don't have admissions ratios of 1% like some of the Ivy Leagues. And so they're just far more realistic options. And I think it would be really great if we could expose YA readers to a wider variety of collegiate options. So just briefly, as brief as I am capable of being, I want to go over some of the corrections for some of these pet peeves that I've seen. So first of all, early decision and early action. Typically, those deadlines are going to be in October and November. It is different for different schools, and early decision and early action are two different things. If you're older, early action probably didn't exist when you applied to college, didn't when I was applying, only early decision existed at the time. So early decision is binding. If you apply to a school early decision and you get in, you basically have guaranteed them that you will accept admission, which is why you can only apply early decision to one school. Early decision is also really only for financially wealthy individuals. It is a huge gamble for students who need financial aid and scholarships to be able to afford college, because while there is technically an exception that if you are accepted early decision and you just cannot afford it, they do not give you a generous financial aid package, you can get out of binding early decision. However, schools will make it hard for you, and their perception of whether you can afford it might not match your reality of whether or not you can afford it, and it's a messy situation. I never recommend early decision for students I work with who are lower income. It is not a good gamble for them. However, early action is great. Early action is a lot more open. Schools introduced this to favor students who did want to express enthusiastic early interest in a school and hear earlier whether or not they were accepted, but without binding. So early action means you apply early, you hear early, but you can still apply to other schools' regular decision, wait to collect all of your college acceptances and financial aid packages, and then make the best decision for you. Within this, I do want to mention single choice early action. This is something that Yale and Harvard do, and that means that you can apply early action, but they only want you to apply early action to one of them. So meaning if you choose single choice early action for Yale, you don't apply single choice early action for Harvard. That's just a thing they do so that you are not shotgunning all of your applications. Which is another term that I should define for you. Now, if you apply early decision and early action, you're going to hear admissions decisions mostly in December, but some of them bleed into January, but really December. So if you do have a character and you want them to know where they are going by December 15th, you want them to apply early decision or early action, but please look up whether the school that you are using has early action or early decision, and just to make sure that it is as accurate as possible. Now, sometimes you will be accepted early decision or early action. Sometimes you will be flat out rejected, which means you are not invited to also apply regular decision. You're done. But sometimes you're deferred, and that means they move your early action or early decision application to the regular decision pool. So you'll still be considered for admission. You'll just be considered against the rest of the regular decision applicant pool. So regular decision deadlines for private universities, your bread and butter time is between December and about January 15. Again, you're gonna have to check with individual schools and when their deadlines are. I'll also say that typically, if you want and need merit aid from most private universities, there is what is called a priority admissions deadline. This tends to be in November or early December. Again, if you have a character who really needs merit aid, you're gonna have to just do your due diligence and check on these deadlines so that you're not perpetuating the idea that you can apply the last day of the deadline and still get a full scholarship. Related to this, scholarships, I'm just gonna roll right into it. So another huge thing I see happen a lot is the character A got into school X, and that's great, so now they're gonna find scholarships so they can afford it. This is probably the biggest misnomer that I see, not just in fiction, but in life. I see this idea perpetuated from students and from their parents on forums all the time, and you have to break the news to them, especially if they're posting this in the spring, that it is too late. The best scholarships, the most generous scholarships, the ones that are going to make a school affordable, come from the schools themselves. This is why you have to really be careful about your application list and select schools that are likely to actually give you the aid that you need in order to attend, because independent scholarships that you apply to, especially the ones in the spring, they're tiny. You might get a $1,000 reward, maybe $2,000. They're usually one time only. They're not renewable, so they'll only be good for freshman year. But most importantly, the competitive field is bonkers. There's thousands of these scholarships and your odds of getting them are slim to none, and honestly, I think they're a waste of your time. It's best that you start strategizing for college admissions in your junior year so that you're not hit in the face with any of these unexpected things. There are some external independent scholarships you can apply to earlier on in the cycle. Usually the deadlines are the summer or the fall of your senior year, but I will say that the best scholarship programs have dwindled. Probably the biggest one that is still around is the Coca-Cola scholarship. This is a one-time $20,000 award based on leadership and community interaction. Really competitive and hard to get, but it's one of the bigger ones and a bigger award. But the Gates Millennium Scholarship is no longer around. That used to be a go-to, a really, really good one. There's also scholarship programs like QuestBridge, but QuestBridge is enormously competitive. I have never personally known a student who got them, and it is specifically for low-income individuals. Also, a quick note, like a cap into that, there is rolling admissions for some schools. Typically state schools or lower tier private schools might have rolling admissions, and that means you can apply anytime and they accept people as they get their applications. So rolling admissions is a thing, and rolling admission schools can often be really, really good for students who need solid safety schools, but it's probably not going to come up in most YA novels, not when they're writing about Harvard. So as I mentioned with financial aid, most schools are $65,000 a year or up. Even state schools, the most prestigious state universities, are $30,000 a year or up. UCs are $30,000-ish for in-state residents. If you're out of state, they're $54,000 a year as of last year, and UCs don't give any financial aid to out-of-state residents. So that's another thing I actually have seen in real life and in fiction, where students from other states get a magical scholarship to attend UCLA. It's not gonna happen. UVA also has, UVA and University of Michigan are some of the best and most competitive state universities in the country. They're on the more expensive side and they're really, really hard to get into, so just kind of be aware of that. So you can't just choose a state university, any state university. University of Texas is another hyper competitive, very academically top-notch system. You can't just pick a state university and be like, oh, that'll be easy, they can get into it. In all of these cases, you have to do your research. So state universities, some are, in the $30,000 range for in-state residents, and then private universities are at least $65,000 most of the time. Now, I don't have the time to go super in-depth about financial aid rules because I could probably talk about financial aid for hours on end, but I hinted at some of the terms. So there is need-based financial aid and there is merit aid. Most of the top 30 elite schools do not give merit aid. That is because everyone who applies to Harvard is academically talented, so there's just no way to distinguish among the field of applicants who is better than anyone else and deserves more money. So typically they just don't give merit-based scholarships. They do athletic scholarships, however, but that's a whole other topic. So with most of these schools, it's about your financial need. The problem is the school determines your need. You have to submit different forms, but then the school has their own individual formula of what constitutes need. So your family may have a budget. They can afford $10,000 a year, but the school might say you can afford $30,000 a year, and that's it. The school says it's so, and so that is what they expect you to pay. So a lot of people can end up having sticker shock when they apply to these schools because they don't understand how they could possibly think they can afford this really high amount. It's honestly not fair. There's also need blind and need aware financial aid schools. So need blind means they don't consider your financial background for admissions. But then, of course, the financial aid office in determining your financial award does, of course, consider your income. Need aware means they do consider your financial background during admissions. So this can help or hurt someone from either a low or a high income background. But ultimately, when it comes to your package, your financial aid package and scholarship packages, regardless of whether admissions was allowed to consider your financial situation, the financial aid office obviously does. Most private schools require the CSS profile. So you've probably heard of FAFSA. This is the Federal Application for Financial Aid. This just determines your federal financial aid kind of floor or window, whether you qualify for anything, and it is based on either a single parent's income or your household income if your parents are married. The CSS profile is a lot more complicated, and any school that requires this is where it's going to get a little messy. The CSS profile wants a lot of personal information. It wants to know about all of your assets, any real estate holdings, savings account including college savings, income of both parents including and especially if they are separated or divorced. So if you've got a divorced parent who's not present, this is another thing I've seen in YA done wrong, and the custodial parent is a single parent and doesn't have a lot of money, but the divorced parent who is estranged is hella rich and will not pay for college. The thing is, the college doesn't care. They're going to look at the estranged parent's income and they're going to factor that into your financial aid decision. There are rare exceptions where you can get what is called a non-custodial waiver. That is to basically say, please don't consider the estranged parent's income. But you can usually only get away with this if you can prove that you cannot find the other parent and or that there is an estrangement, like a serious estrangement. So to give you an idea, if dad kind of, effed off and you haven't seen him for 2 years, but you know where he is, you're probably not going to get an exception. But in my case, for example, I was raised by a single parent. When I applied to college, I had never met my father. I got a non-custodial waiver, but a lot of students don't. Oh, so depressing. Here's another really, really important one. I've seen this one wrong in multiple books and TV shows and movies, and that is you are considered dependent on your parents as far as financial aid is considered until you are in your 20s. You're considered a dependent until you are 24 years old. The thing that I've seen done wrong is people assume that when you turn 18 that the student is going to be applying for financial aid as an 18-year-old independent individual, and that is simply not the case. Turning 18 is meaningless. It does nothing until you're 24. The colleges are going to look at your parents' financial information to determine your aid award. This can be a problem if you have parents who won't pay for college. The only choice you have, it's not to turn 18. The only two real choices you have are to be declared independent, essentially be emancipated from your parents, which is not easy to do, especially for this reason. The other one is to get married. For very obvious reasons, a lot of people aren't going to do this when they turn 18 in order to pay for college, but those are the only two situations I have heard of where there is an exception made. Otherwise, you're dependent on your parents till you're 24, regardless of your parental situation. Now I want to talk briefly about loans. That's the other thing. If let's say you have a student who gets into a school and the college expects them to pay $15,000 a year, the student themselves cannot get a loan, not by themselves. The highest amount you can qualify for federal loans is, I believe it's $4,500 as a freshman. I will double check that and I can drop the real one down below. But I know that the max that you can take out as a student by the time you are a senior, federal loans as an individual, is $7,500. That obviously isn't going to pay the $15,000. In order to get loans, if you get a private loan, it has to be co-signed with your parents or another guarantor. So it's usually relative, because what strange adult with good credit is going to agree to, essentially be responsible for your loan debt for college. So you need to have parents who have good credit or are willing to co-sign your loans for you in order to get private loans. There's also something called a Parent Plus loan. This is something that didn't exist when I was going to school. And this is a federal loan that your parents take on. It has a much higher cap, so they can take out large amounts, but the loan is 100% on your parents. And a lot of parents don't want to do this because the student has no responsibility for the loans whatsoever. The catch-22 is the terms of a Parent Plus loan are a lot more generous, and they're not that generous, but they're more generous than private loan terms. I actually do not recommend private loans for students to pay for school because they are really, really predatory. Honestly, Sally Mae is the worst. They're pretty evil. My experience with private loans was pretty terrible, and I do not recommend them, especially if you are a lower income student. Even if your parents do qualify to co-sign these loans for you, they're very predatory, and you're gonna find once you've graduated that they can be impossible to pay. Some of the monthly amounts, they can be in the thousands. They are not at all forgiving or generous about deferring, and it can just be a pain in the ass. It can really be a life ruiner taking on a lot of debt. And a quick note on that in terms of why they are so predatory: private loans are not forgivable in death. They're also not dischargeable in bankruptcy. This means you cannot declare bankruptcy to get away from your student loans, not if you have private loans. And if you die, this is so morbid, but if a student dies, their parents can't get the loan forgiven either. I've read some horror stories of students who went into six-figure debt for their undergraduate education. The student unfortunately died when they were 24, 25 years old, and then their parents were saddled with 6 figures of debt for a beloved child for their education that no one gets to use. It is heartbreaking, it happens all the time, and I think that private loan companies are kind of the worst. Just like a quick end note on financial aid, honestly, it's really, really complicated. This barely scratches the surface of financial aid, but this is just to give you a sense of how complicated it is and why it's so easy to screw it up. I really do recommend, if you are covering anything like this in your YA novel, to reach out to experts to ask questions. You can go to College Confidential. They have forums. The parents on these forums they're a little intense, but they actually know a lot about these things. They can answer your questions. You can reach out to someone like me. I have a good amount of information, and when I don't know something, I either know how to find it or I can refer you to the right place. And I'm sure there are other individuals in our writer community who have similar areas of expertise and will essentially offer to be consultants or betas. And last but not least, just talking about the competitiveness of schools and elite schools. As I mentioned, you can't apply to all rich schools and expect to get into at least one of them, or get into at least one of them and get a full ride scholarship. I have legitimately seen students who applied to 12 schools. All of them were elite schools, and they were rejected from every single one of them, leaving them with nowhere to go for college. This forced them to take a gap year. I've also seen situations where students only applied to elite schools, did get into them, and then couldn't afford any of them. In some cases, they're lucky. They have a state school fallback because, thank God, they applied to a true safety, but in some cases, they don't. I've also seen cases where a student who was lower income applied to a bunch of elite schools that were need aware and was rejected from every single one of them. If you're not academically competitive enough to be offered a merit scholarship, in a lot of cases, elite schools will reject you even if you are qualified to attend, if they know that you cannot afford to go. College admissions, it's brutal, it's not fair. The landscape has really changed. Honestly, if you know a teenager who has to apply to college, give them a hug. Because what they are going through, we can't even fathom it. Like, I can't fathom it sometimes, because there was never a question in my mind that I would get into one of the 4 schools I applied to and that I would probably be able to afford it. I would never advise a student now to only apply to 4 schools unless they were 4 mega safety. So schools that had admissions, they admitted 70% or more of the class and they were generous with financial aid. I advise most students to apply to 8 to 12 schools and to make sure that only a very small number of them are these elite schools. So elite schools is typically going to be the top 30 ranked schools, give or take. The hyper elites are in like the top 15 to 20. And you have to look up the financial aid policies of these different schools. There are some very good top schools, especially mid-tier elites, that are generous with not just financial aid, but merit aid. But you need to ask the right people and do your research to find out which schools are actually attainable for your fictional character. I know this sounds like really intense, like, why do you care? But I don't know, it's something that bothers me, and I do think that, teens read YA, it's their genre, and I ache for the unrealistic expectations that they might get from some books that just, where the author meant well, but didn't do the due diligence to see how things had changed or how things were financially for students who fall outside of wealth and privilege. So that's kind of my soapbox moment about college admissions in YA. I'm sorry for how long this one was. This is like a combo, like, crash course in like college admissions if you are a younger person either applying to school or a parent with a teenager who's going to be applying to schools. This is the tip of the iceberg. As ever, but especially here, really happy to answer questions down below, especially if you're writing a book where you have a character going off to college. I have basically done consults for imaginary characters for people before. They tell me about their character in their YA novel, and as someone who often advises students on what schools they might want to apply to, I will develop a college list, a realistic college list for your character. I have done that. I don't always have the time, but I will try my best. So thank you so much for watching, especially this weird little niche soapbox topic. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, everyone, happy writing.